And then the next thing I see is I saw a hammer go into Dale's head.
This is Marissa Devault, and in January 2009, she carried out the unthinkable, involving her own husband and a hammer. This was an act brutal in its intimacy, committed not by a stranger in the night, but by the very woman who had once vowed to love him for life. However, Marissa's own story is not one of heartbreak or desperation. Instead, it is tangled in betrayal, secret affairs, financial ruin, and a motive so selfish it shocked even the most seasoned of detectives. And while she may have believed that she had the perfect cover story, her lies began to unravel almost as quickly as her alibis changed, leaving behind a trail of deceit, manipulation, and a truth far darker than anyone expected. Hey there folks, and welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime. My name's Adrian, and today's story comes with a cocktail of lies, deceit, betrayal, and even sugar daddies. With an alibi that changes more often than your ex-partner's Netflix password and a motive that seems to be so self-absorbed it could have been written by a narcissist, this case spirals from bizarre to downright outrageous. And of course, I'm talking about the case of Marissa Devault. By the way, that surname is so strange. The French usually say Devault and Americans usually say Devault, but this one, she was adamant it's Devault. So settle in, hit the subscribe button to join the Coffeehouse Crime community, and please grab yourself a coffee, or maybe something stronger for this case. Anyway, this is the case of Marissa Devault. Welcome to Phoenix, Arizona, folks. A city that faces many extremes and loves to go big. With more than 1.6 million residents calling this place home, Phoenix is actually the 5th most populated city in the whole of the United States. Life here is grand, yet also scarce, and that's probably because you have a sprawling modern city in the middle of a harsh and unrelenting desert. But beneath the sunny exterior lies a darker history too. Beginning in the 1960s, Phoenix consistently ranked among the nation's most crime-ridden cities. And then throughout the 70s and 80s, crime rates would only climb higher, peaking in 1993 at over 1,100 crimes per 100,000 people, meaning that 1 in every 100 residents was either a victim of or involved in a crime here. Now, since then, law enforcement has successfully pushed back, and although the city's crime rates have indeed fallen, Phoenix still ranks amongst one of the most dangerous cities in the whole of the United States. And I have to say, it's given us some of the country's most infamous cases too, like Jodi Arias, for example, a woman who dominated headlines with her extremely odd behavior. Side note, but Jodi Arias is actually one of the first videos that I covered here on Coffeehouse Crime around about 4 years ago. But just a quick warning, if you do go watch the video, please ignore the lockdown haircut and of course the production quality. The reason is quite simple really, as I hadn't yet found my editor, Callum. And speaking of quality, this video is sponsored by Raycon. You know, the funny thing is, when they reached out to me for a sponsorship, I already owned a pair, so I know exactly what I'm talking about here. And the thing that I really like about Raycon is that they rival these so-called premium brands, but at a much more affordable price. And these things pack a serious punch too. They've got active noise cancellation, which, quite honestly, I think half the courtroom could have used during Jodi Arias' trial. You also have multi-point connectivity, meaning that I can pair them with both my laptop and phone at the very same time. That means no more awkward fumbling when Callum rings me mid-edit to say, "Adrian, I think you're going way too dark with this one." Truthfully, I love these things, especially while I'm out on my morning walk. They're ergonomic, comfortable, and stay in place no matter what I'm doing. Whether that's at the gym, pacing around with my 3rd coffee of the day, or even chasing Nero around the apartment. The new colours are beautiful too. Personally, I'm into carbon black. It's simple, timeless, and matches my coffee, which if you've been here long enough will know is basically 90% of my personality. With 32 hours of battery life with the case, that is enough to last you 60 episodes of Coffeehouse Crime. All of this at half the price of other big-name audio brands, which means no more overpaying for great sound. So click the link in the description or go to buyraycon.com/coffeehousecrime to get 20% off site-wide and join the over 3 million people who already enjoy Raycon. And what's more is they come with a 30-day happiness guarantee, meaning that if you don't love them for any reason, then returns are painless. That's buyraycon.com/coffeehousecrime, and thank you Raycon for sponsoring this video. Alright, now let's get straight back to Phoenix. Jodi Arias aside, I'll be kind and blame the city's crime rate on the heat. But quite clearly, the desert has no shortage of high-profile homicides. Now, when police dispatchers answer the phone, it is usually over minor disputes, petty thefts, or the occasional butt dial. However, in the early morning hours of January the 14th, 2009, all of that changed when Arizona police received a frantic phone call from a woman who sounded beyond distressed. Without providing her name, she was chatting so quickly and chaotically that the operator could barely make out a word of what she was saying. The only thing that she could gather was one word, which was help. However, moments later, the line suddenly went dead. Dispatch immediately redialed, and once again, the same frantic voice answered. She was still incomprehensible, and again, just like last time, the line was then suddenly cut off. Operators scrambled to trace the signal, dispatching police officers to the address as soon as they discovered it. However, before they could even reach the property, a third phone call came through. It was her again, who this time simply asked, "Are they coming?" Unprovoked and out of nowhere, she then suddenly said, "He was strangling me." And when asked if he had any weapons on him, she replied with, "Not anymore." Only a few minutes later, a first response team pulled up outside of the property, and in the hallway, they found the woman shaking, with her forehead covered in blood. Beside her was another man who was trying to steady her, who quickly told the officers that his name was Stanley Cook Jr. Soon enough, officers verified the woman to be Marissa Devault, and the man next to her, Stanley, was her housemate. She also confirmed that upstairs they could find her 3 daughters safe and sound asleep. However, this is where the story begins to get a little bit strange, because when asked if she was okay or if she was injured, Marissa explained that the blood was not actually hers, but instead belonged to her husband, Dale Harrell. She also told them that if they were to travel upstairs, they could find him lying on the bedroom floor. Paramedics rushed to the master bedroom, and what they found was a horrific scene. The bedsheets were soaked in blood, the walls were spattered, and the floors were stained. But despite the sheer amount of blood loss, to their shock and surprise, Dale was still actually alive. First responders immediately sprang into action. He was clinging to life, but put bluntly, his injuries were catastrophic. Surprisingly, Marissa appeared to be right about that hammer. In a desperate attempt to try and save his life, Dale was rushed to the nearest hospital. Meanwhile, officers realigned their focus towards the crime scene and his wife. Now, Marissa definitely knew a thing or two about his injuries. I mean, it was quite literally painted all over her face. But in her current state, they were lucky to even get a word or two from her. From what investigators could piece together from her friend Stan, was that the couple had been arguing for most of the night, and when he later heard Marissa screaming, that is when he decided to intervene. Grabbing a claw hammer just in case, Stan then barged into the couple's bedroom, and that is where he allegedly found Dale on top of Marissa, who was now unconscious and bruised. And giving Dale no time to react, that is when Stan apparently struck him multiple times until he collapsed to the floor. And that's how the story goes, in their minds at least. But the authorities, well, they were not so convinced, and you could say that they already noticed that several things were not quite adding up. But before we go any further, let's first talk about who these people were, and more specifically, how it all ended in such a violent struggle. Marissa, who was 34, and Dale, 36, were a couple that lived in the quiet suburb of Gilbert, Arizona. Throughout the years, the two held typical traditional roles, where Marissa was a stay-at-home mother, and Dale worked as a mechanical engineer at a nearby firm. Between them, they also had 3 daughters together. Their oldest, Rhiannon, who was 13 years old at the time, was actually from Marissa's previous relationship with another man. But to Dale, that did not actually matter, and he loved Rhiannon just as much as if she were his own. So, it turns out that both Marissa and Dale actually knew each other throughout high school, when they both attended Lake Havasu. But back then, the relationship never went beyond platonic. They were in different years after all, and rarely crossed paths. It was immediately after high school that the main differences between the two really stood out. For example, Marissa jumped straight into various customer service roles. However, when she became pregnant with Rhiannon, her life was basically thrown into turmoil. Unfortunately, the father was always out of the picture, and so money quickly became a pressing issue. But Marissa persevered, and with her being determined to support her baby by any means possible, she unfortunately stepped into the more controversial side of work by becoming an exotic dancer at a gentleman's club. In case you're wondering or just curious, her stage name was Reese Cup, probably a play on Reese's peanut butter cups, which, to be fair to her, are quite delicious. I suppose she was sweet enough to lure you in, and nutty enough to keep things interesting. Meanwhile, Dale graduated a couple years after Marissa, of course because he was a couple years younger, before then going on to study mechanical engineering in college, and then specializing in refrigeration technology. The man was quite forward-thinking, and clearly setting himself up for a solid career. Side note, but for those of you who've been here for a while, you'll know that I also used to be an engineer. But then YouTube happened, and it basically ruined my chances of ever having a normal CV again. So, who knows what happens next? Maybe it's exotic dancing for me. I mean, I've already mastered the art of making people quite uncomfortable in 4K. Anyway, although their lives were quite different for a while, Marissa and Dale would eventually reconnect in their early 20s after a chance encounter in Phoenix. They started chatting and meeting up regularly afterwards, and that is when the relationship would quickly turn romantic. Now, Dale was not actually fazed at all by the fact that Marissa was a single peanut butter cup mum. Instead, he seemed to embrace the idea, and as for Rhiannon, he naturally slid into a rather fatherly role. So much so that, by the end of the month, she and her mother had become his two favorite people. Shortly after, Dale and Marissa moved in together before eventually making things official. With Dale's steady income and his strong work ethic, he was also building his own refrigeration business and providing a solid foundation for the growing family. The stability meant that Marissa could quit her own job and now stay home with Rhiannon instead, swapping late nights and stilettos for bedtime stories and packed lunches. It is clear to see that Dale was a very good man. He loved his family and wanted all of them to feel safe, happy, and supported. Within a couple years, the two married, and soon after, they welcomed two other children to the family, that being little Kiernan and little Danon. By all outward appearances, they were a happy family like any other. But the truth is that their marriage was not without its own fair share of complications. Now, Dale was easygoing, steady, and down to earth. He certainly wasn't extravagant, but also he didn't need to be. What mattered most to him was providing for his family and being present for his three girls. Marissa, on the other hand, was a handful to say the least. She was impulsive, temperamental, and particularly reckless with money. You could say that she had a hard time managing her finances, and that affected Dale and the kids quite severely. These clashing attitudes towards money caused a lot of tension behind closed doors, which would often end in shouting matches, arguments, and even doors being slammed by Marissa after she stormed out. None of these things were unheard of in the household, and even neighbors would worry from time to time. And sadly, that also means that many of these blow-ups were often witnessed and seen by their own daughters. In later years, Marissa claimed that Dale's anger turned into violence. She accused him of emotional abuse and even suspected him of being unfaithful. However, both friends and family all claimed that they had never seen this from him before, and instead described him as gentle, loving, sensible, and patient. And rather interestingly, it was actually Marissa who was known to be volatile. Many of her friends knew how often she would trash the house, and those familiar with her knew how much she loved money. And all of this was in stark contrast to Dale, who was frugal, sensible, and peaceful. Unsurprisingly, but due to Marissa freewheeling all of the time, and the challenge of supporting a family of 5 on a single income, the couple would often find themselves to be short on cash by the end of the month. And so, with bills piling up and trying to make ends meet, they decided to take on a lodger, that being 31-year-old Stanley Cook Jr. Now, having Stan as a housemate provided a little bit extra income, and with him being available half of the time, he could even help support the kids too. And by all accounts, Stan was actually a decent lodger. one who kept to himself and even respected their space. Now, despite their many issues, one thing was very clear about Marissa and Dale's marriage, and that is that Dale absolutely adored his wife. For all of her shortcomings and her issues, he loved her and their children endlessly. So, with that in mind, how did Dale go from both peaceful and loving to the apparently abusive man who was now dying on the floor? Well, to answer that question, we must go back to the crime scene. Now, according to Marissa and Stan had attacked Dale in an effort to protect Marissa from him. However, the investigators began to grow suspicious when they started examining the crime scene more closely. To begin with, extensive blood spatter analysis of the crime scene did not support their theory. In fact, bloodstains indicated that Dale had actually been alone in the bed at the time of being assaulted, and that Marissa was not actually underneath him as she had claimed. Further analysis of the room showed no sign of any struggle either. For example, Marissa escaped with all of her fingernails both perfectly manicured and intact, suggesting that she was never in a position where she had to scratch or claw to defend herself. Evidence also pointed to Marissa being in the same room during the attack, while there was no evidence that Stan was even in the room at all. And then, when they turned their attention to the claw hammer, they discovered that not only was it covered in Marissa's DNA, but it actually held no trace of Stan's DNA either. With all of this information combined, the police were confident enough to finally arrest Marissa on suspicion of assaulting Dale, who, at the time, was still fighting for his life in hospital. But despite now being in custody, she still maintained that Stanley was in fact the one who actually attacked Dale. She would even create a written statement confessing this. But again, the investigators were not so convinced, to say the least. There was something about Marissa's story that was not quite adding up, and everybody knew it, but how or what or why was still anyone's guess. And so they began to take a closer look at Stanley Cook and his version of the events, and what they found was deeply concerning. So, as it turns out, Stan was actually in a serious motorbike accident back in the year 1998, which left him not only with a brain injury, but severe short-term memory loss. Which of course leads us to the night that Dale was murdered, and surprise surprise, he eventually confessed to officers that he couldn't remember anything from that night. Apparently, it was all just one giant blank for him, and so he relied on Marissa to tell him what had happened. And of course, that leads to the obvious possibility that Marissa might have been using his memory loss for her own personal gain. So, this was enough for the officers to feel uneasy about the situation, but not really enough to convict her. They needed more evidence first, and, of course, a motive. Without any substantial evidence, Marissa was permitted to post bail and then return home. Meanwhile, detectives continued to look for more information. They began by conducting a deep dive into the family's emails and financial records, and what they found did not paint Marissa in a good light whatsoever. It turns out that her bank statements showed transactions that could not actually be linked to Dale's earnings, meaning that Marissa had a secret source of cash flowing into her bank account. And we're not talking 10 or 20 bucks here, but hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, where could all of this money be coming from? Well, it didn't take long for the authorities to find out. It turns out that Marissa had actually been leading a secret double life, and one that Dale knew nothing about. She had found herself a sugar daddy, and one that she believed would solve all of her money problems. The man's name was Alan Flores, a wealthy businessman who was ready to spoil Marissa for as much as she wanted. They exchanged emails, and then phone numbers, and then over time began a sexual relationship, and all of this spanned for more than 2 years without Dale's knowledge whatsoever. So, in essence, over the course of 2 years, not only was she carrying an affair, but she was trading companionship and favors for cash all behind Dale's back. And would you believe that she received more than $360,000 from Alan? However, despite the arrangements, it wasn't actually all that peachy between the two, and after a couple of years of infidelity, Alan had grown tired of Marissa's endless demands. He wanted out of this situationship, and it turns out that he also wanted all of his money back, and if she couldn't pay him, well, Alan threatened legal action to recover what he could. Now, obviously, this would have exposed her secret affair, and that is when Marissa panicked. Facing the potential destruction of her marriage and her family, legal charges, and a massive debt she couldn't repay, Marissa was quite clearly in very hot water. As her debts mounted and tensions escalated, Marissa faced one horrible choice: confronting her looming financial ruin or escape it by any means necessary, and tragically, she chose the latter. While detectives were slowly learning about all of this, Dale still remained in critical condition. An emergency surgery had somewhat stabilized him at the time, but sadly, he never woke up. Dale lay unconscious in that hospital bed, trapped in the limbo between life and death, with the rest of his family at his side. As the weeks passed, their confidence in his recovery never improved, and by February the 9th, doctors and family made the heartbreaking decision to switch off his life support, and at the age of 34, Dale passed away, surrounded by his loved ones. Now that Dale had lost his life as a result of his injuries, Marissa's charges escalated from assault to full-blown homicide. And with this case now effectively a murder investigation, the authorities made the decision to bring her back into custody. However, they wouldn't have to look very far for her, because only one day after his death, Marissa herself turned up in hospital. But how and why? Well, according to her, she was out on her usual morning jog when all of a sudden she was attacked from behind. Now, to be fair to her, her injuries were, well, not life-threatening, but quite bad in the end, suffering a broken jaw and ankle in the process. Given that her attacker must have known her usual jogging route, everyone started to believe that maybe Stanley was the assailant. And when they checked his clothes and items back at the family home, they realized that a lot of them were in fact covered in Marissa's blood. But why would he do such a thing? Well, if you're going to believe this story at all, then the obvious answer is revenge. But after talking to Stan, looking into his whereabouts, and then having a look at her injuries again, they realized that actually, although he had attacked Marissa, all of this was staged. Of course, officers were now worried for Marissa's safety, and so they decided to have a little chat with Stan. So, here is the plot twist, but after talking to Stan, he did actually admit that yes, he had attacked Marissa. But the funny thing is, she had asked him to do it. The entire thing was staged, and you can probably guess why already, but of course, it was over some measly insurance scheme, because Marissa was desperate for money. Considering her injuries, Marissa was given grace to recover in hospital, but of course, as soon as she felt better, she was then arrested on suspicion of murder. So, here we are yet again with Marissa in custody, this time for charges far more serious. And during a fresh round of interrogations, detectives laid out all of the mounting evidence against her. It was at that point that Marissa finally cracked. She now provided a completely different story to detectives, and a third version of the events. In this new version of her story, she claimed that she had attacked Dale, but only in self-defense and because she had snapped under years of abuse. However, it is not the kind of reactive self-defense that you would expect, because Marissa would also admit that she had silently crept into the bedroom and then attacked Dale while he was sleeping. Meanwhile, Stanley heard all of this commotion and then ran over to investigate, and that is when he caught her mid-attack and seized the hammer from her. Marissa also confessed that she doesn't remember how many times she hit Dale, but quite clearly it was a lot. Now that she had finally admitted that she murdered him, Marissa's only chance at freedom was through self-defense. In order to do this, she claimed that Dale had sent her to the hospital multiple times from beatings. But the thing is, that was quite easy to disprove. All the investigators had to do was search her medical records and hospital visits. And, well, they found absolutely nothing to support this theory. She also tried to claim that one time Dale had pushed her so hard that her shoulder dislocated. Apparently, one of her friends had to push the shoulder back into place. But when police interviewed those witnesses, none of them corroborated her story. In fact, every witness said that they had never seen any indication that Dale actually abused Marissa. It was quite the opposite, actually, and they only spoke of how well Dale treated her and how aggressive she could be towards him. As the investigation continued, more of Marissa's deceptions came to light. For example, friends and family recalled Marissa making outrageous claims about a large inheritance from her stepfather, who, as it turned out, was still very much alive and never left her a penny. She had even explained that this inheritance was arranged by one of her stepfather's ex-lovers, whom she named as Alan Flores. But the truth is, he was actually just her sugar daddy. And speaking of Alan, by now he had confessed to the officers that, yes, he had been sending Marissa hundreds of thousands of dollars. Not only that, but no inheritance existed. It gets even worse too. Alan also claimed that she had tried to blackmail him into murdering Dale for her, and when he refused, she floated the idea of murdering him herself and trying to frame it as self-defense. Armed with this information, officers now saw Alan as a key witness against Marissa, and although he was hesitant to testify at first, all of that changed when they executed a search warrant on his own home. And that's because, amongst the data on one of his hard drives, officers found illegal material of underage people, which of course they saw as a tool to try to get him to testify. Now, this is kind of like fighting evil with evil, but the authorities offered Alan a deal. They basically said that if he were to testify against Marissa, then he would receive partial immunity against his own charges. And weirdly enough, but while in court, they also promised that they would portray him as some sort of victim of Marissa's and not a villain. So basically, they portrayed this predator as an innocent person merely because there was another larger predator in the room. Yeah, I don't like that. Now, obviously, Alan opted to take that deal, and with Marissa's revised confession, Alan's info, witness testimonies, and all of those financial records, the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. With all of this information, detectives could now conclude that the main motive behind Dale's murder was quite obvious actually. It was money. By now, Marissa was way in over her head, and in an effort to pay off the $360,000 that she owed Alan and all of her other lines of credit, she decided to murder her husband and then collect all of his life insurance. Unfortunately, it's a story that we've seen 1,000 times before already. On February the 27th, 2009, Marissa was formally charged with 1 count of first-degree murder, and prosecutors announced that they would seek the death penalty. Surprisingly, it would take 5 long years for her to finally stand trial, and by 2014, her case had captured headlines all across Arizona. With Jodi Arias still fresh in the public's memory, media outlets drew immediate comparisons. Jodi, of course, also claimed self-defense here and accused that her lover, Alexander, was abusive. And with both of them sporting long dark hair and glasses, some people even believed that the two were related. Marissa's trial began in January of 2014 and would run for 3 long months into April. And let me say, her trial was an absolute spectacle. Now, the prosecution's case was quite obvious. However, the defense had a wildly different story. They maintained that Marissa snapped after years of abuse, citing her mental health, her fear of Dale, and the cycle of control that she claimed she was trapped in. But over the weeks, the prosecution would present a mountain of evidence. This included both photographs and analysis of the crime scene, testimonies from friends and family, and, of course, her financial and love affair with Alan. When Alan took the stand, Marissa's defense team quite naturally tried to skewer his credibility. He testified that he loaned Marissa the money when she pitched an insurance payback plan to him. And when he tried to cut ties with her and get his money back, Marissa panicked and then set her plan into motion. But Marissa's defense would stick to their narrative. In fact, they would even put Marissa's now 18-year-old daughter Rhiannon on the stand. Rhiannon, who was not related to Dale, described the household as tumultuous, and even claimed that Dale was frequently abusive towards her mother. The defense would also go after Alan's credibility too, highlighting that he had been given an immunity deal on the pornography allegations in exchange for his testimony. However, clinical psychologist Dr. Janine DeMart, who was actually the same psychologist for Jodi Arias, would testify that although Marissa did show signs of PTSD, which of course could be indicative of abuse from Dale, she also had antisocial personality disorder. Not only that, but the signs of PTSD could have come from her own childhood instead. Marissa's trial wrapped up in early April 2014, where the jury then got to work on deciding her fate. It took nearly a week of deliberation for them to finally reach a decision. But on April the 8th, Marissa was found guilty of first-degree murder. On April the 22nd, she was then sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, narrowly escaping the death penalty, which is allowed in Arizona. Marissa herself addressed the jury to apologize, saying, "I can't do anything more than say I am sorry, and my heart goes out to them." His mother and father have had to experience the worst loss in the world. But if those words were meant to earn sympathy, they fell on deaf ears. According to a psychologist who had monitored her, Marissa talked about Dale's murder on the phone and even laughed about it. Obviously, she held no remorse, not to Dale and not to his family either, because after they had requested that his ashes be returned to them, Marissa simply refused out of spite. With all said and done, Marissa will now spend her time behind bars at the Arizona State Prison Complex, which just so happens to be the same place that Jodi is in. And according to some reports, the two have allegedly become good friends, because of course they have. Dale was only 34 years old when he passed away. He was an engineer, a husband, a father of 3 young girls, and a man who, by every account, gave his all to the people he loved. What mattered most to him was quite simple: working hard, caring for his family, and being present for his children. We will never quite know for certain if the allegations against Dale were true, but given the evidence available and the motive that Marissa pushed, it is highly unlikely. He seemed like a very sweet man who, unfortunately, had his kindness turned against him by the person he loved most. Now, as always, before I end this video, I'd love to know what you think about this one. Do you believe in Marissa's story, or do you think it was baloney? And should she have received the death penalty? And yeah, I think that basically wraps up this story today, folks. Thank you so much for watching today, I really do appreciate it. Thank you again to Raycon for sponsoring today's video. Go to buyraycon.com/coffeehousecrime to get 20% off site-wide. Anyway, for now, I'm gonna leave it there today, folks. Thank you again for watching, and as always, I'll see you again next week for another new video. Until that moment arrives though, remember to look after yourselves, look after each other, and of course, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.